I was cleaning out the attic when I found my daughter's diary tucked inside an old shoebox, and when I opened it to the entry dated March 15, 2004, my hand started shaking so badly I almost dropped it. The words written in her careful teenage handwriting made my blood run cold. Mom doesn't know that Dad isn't really Jacob's father. I've known for 3 years and it's killing me to keep this secret. But if I tell her, it will destroy our family. So I'll take this to my grave. My daughter Claire died in a car accident 2 weeks after writing those words. She was 17 years old, and she'd been carrying a secret that would have shattered everything I thought I knew about my life. 20 years later, standing in that dusty attic with her diary in my hands, I realized that some truths refuse to stay buried no matter how deep you try to hide them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Thornton, and at 58 years old, I thought I had made peace with my past. My husband Richard and I have been married for 36 years, raising 2 children in our comfortable home in Portland, Oregon. Claire had been our firstborn, brilliant and sensitive, with her father's dark eyes and my stubborn determination. Then came Jacob, 5 years younger, with sandy blonde hair that neither Richard nor I possessed, though we'd always attributed it to my grandmother's Norwegian heritage. After Claire's death, Richard and I had clung to each other and to Jacob, our grief bonding us together even as it hollowed us out from the inside. We'd survived the unsurvivable, or so I thought. Jacob was now 32, married to a lovely woman named Sophia, with twin daughters who were the light of our lives. Richard had retired from his position as a civil engineer 2 years ago, and we'd settled into a comfortable routine of grandparenting, gardening, and the occasional trip to visit Richard's sister in California. Life wasn't perfect, but it was peaceful, predictable, safe. The attic cleaning hadn't been my idea. Our house was built in 1965, and the attic had become a repository for 40 years of accumulated memories, broken furniture, and boxes we'd been meaning to sort through for decades. But our roof had started leaking during the last storm, and the contractor had informed us that he needed complete access to the attic space to assess the damage and make repairs. That meant everything had to come down. Richard's bad knee meant the job fell mostly to me, with some help from Jacob on weekends. I'd been at it for 3 days, working my way through boxes of Christmas decorations, old tax returns, clothes from the 80s that I'd somehow convinced myself might come back in style, and towers of photo albums documenting our family's history. Each box was a trip down memory lane, some sweet, some painful, all of them requiring me to make decisions about what to keep and what to finally let go. The shoebox had been wedged behind a broken lamp, and a box of Richard's college textbooks. It was nothing special, just a plain brown Nike shoebox with the size and style faded on the lid. When I pulled it out, something rattled inside, and I assumed it would be old jewelry or buttons or some other small items Claire had saved. My daughter had been a collector, always tucking away meaningful objects, ticket stubs from concerts, pressed flowers, smooth stones from the beach. Opening her things still hurt even after 20 years, but I'd learned to breathe through the pain, to let myself remember without drowning in the grief. Inside the shoebox, I found a tangle of friendship bracelets, a few photographs of Claire with her high school friends, a small ceramic cat I'd given her for her 10th birthday, and buried at the bottom, a journal with a purple fabric cover that I'd never seen before. My heart started beating faster as I picked it up. The cover was worn at the edges, and when I opened it, I recognized Claire's handwriting immediately. She'd had beautiful penmanship, each letter carefully formed, unlike my own messy scrawl. The first entry was dated January 2003, her junior year of high school. I sat down on an old trunk and began to read, knowing I was invading her privacy but unable to stop myself. These were my daughter's thoughts from her final year of life, and I'd been robbed of so much time with her that I couldn't resist this chance to know her mind again, to hear her voice even if only on paper. The early entries were typical teenage concerns. Stress about the SATs, excitement about being accepted to the drama club's spring production, complaints about her chemistry teacher who assigned too much homework, observations about her friends and their various dramas. She wrote about a boy named Marcus who sat behind her in English class and made her laugh. She wrote about feeling pressure to decide on colleges when she wasn't sure what she wanted to study. She wrote about missing our family dog Bailey who had died the previous summer. Reading her words was like having her back for a moment, and I found myself smiling through tears as her personality came alive on the pages. But then I reached the entry from March 1, 2004, and everything changed. I saw Mom's hospital bracelet today in the jewelry box on her dresser. I was looking for my grandmother's earrings that Mom said I could borrow for the spring dance, and there it was tucked in the back corner. Baby girl Thornton, born April 12, 1987. That's Jacob's birthday. But the bracelet said the baby was a girl. I stared at it for a long time trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was from a miscarriage Mom never told us about. Maybe she had a daughter who died and then had Jacob. But something about it felt wrong. Felt like a secret I'd stumbled onto by accident. I put everything back exactly how I found it and didn't mention it to anyone. But I can't stop thinking about it. I read the entry 3 times, my mind racing. I knew exactly what bracelet Claire was talking about. I'd kept it all these years, hidden away because it represented the most painful period of my life. But Claire had misunderstood what she'd seen. The truth was more complicated and far more devastating than a simple mix-up at the hospital. I turned the page with trembling hands, dreading what I might find next. The entry from March 8, 2004 made my blood turn cold. I asked Aunt Linda about the hospital bracelet today when we were alone in her kitchen. I didn't tell her I'd been snooping, just said I'd found it by accident and was curious. Her face went completely white, and she grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. She made me promise never to tell Mom I'd seen it, never to mention it to anyone, especially not to Dad or Jacob. Then she told me something that I wish I could unhear. Mom and Dad had a baby girl in April 1987. The baby died 2 days after birth. Some kind of heart defect that no one knew about until it was too late. Mom was devastated, completely destroyed by grief. She couldn't even talk about it, couldn't process it, just shut down completely. Dad was worried she might hurt herself. 3 months later, Aunt Linda got a call from a friend who worked in social services. There was a baby boy who needed immediate placement. The mother was very young, not ready to be a parent, wanted a closed adoption. The timing was strange, the circumstances were rushed, but Dad thought it might help Mom heal if she had a baby to care for. So they took Jacob. They never told anyone he was adopted, not even family. They just said Mom had been pregnant again and had the baby early. Everyone accepted it because Mom had been so withdrawn that people assumed she was just dealing with complicated grief. I had to set the diary down. My hands were shaking so badly I couldn't hold it steady. Aunt Linda was my sister, my older sister, who had always been protective of me, sometimes to the point of being controlling. She'd been there through everything, through my pregnancy with Claire, through the nightmare of losing my first son, through the chaos of Jacob's arrival in our lives. But I'd never known she'd told Claire any of this. I'd never known my daughter had carried this knowledge. And there was more entries I hadn't read yet. Secrets my daughter had uncovered that I'd spent 20 years keeping buried. The entry from March 12 was even worse. I can't stop thinking about what Aunt Linda told me. Jacob is adopted. My little brother isn't really my brother, not by blood. And Mom and Dad have been lying about it for his entire life. I've been watching them differently now, looking for signs, trying to understand why they'd keep such a huge secret. And then today I overheard something that made everything make terrible sense. Mom was on the phone in her bedroom, and I was walking past to go to the bathroom. The door was cracked open and I heard her crying, really crying in that way she does when she thinks no one can hear. She was saying, "I can't tell him, Richard. I can't tell him the truth. It would destroy him. He loves you so much. He trusts you completely. How can I tell him that you're not his father? How can I tell him that I made a mistake, that I was so broken after we lost our son that I wasn't thinking clearly, that I let someone else comfort me in ways I shouldn't have?" I couldn't read anymore. I closed the diary and pressed it against my chest, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. This couldn't be true. This couldn't be what Claire had thought she'd overheard. But even as I tried to deny it, memories were flooding back, memories I'd spent 2 decades trying to suppress. The months after losing my first son had been the darkest period of my life. I'd barely been functional, moving through days in a fog of grief and guilt. Richard had been patient but helpless, unable to reach me through the wall of pain I'd built around myself. And then there was David, Richard's best friend from college, who had come to stay with us for a few weeks that summer to help Richard manage the household and take care of Claire while I was lost in my depression. David had been kind and gentle and understood grief in a way Richard didn't because David had lost his own wife to cancer 2 years earlier. We'd talked late into the night while Richard worked overtime trying to keep us financially afloat. David had held me while I cried, had listened to me rage against the unfairness of losing a child, had told me that the pain would eventually become bearable, even if it never completely went away. And one terrible night when I'd felt so empty and broken that I didn't think I could survive another day, David had kissed me. I'd kissed him back. We'd crossed a line that should never have been crossed, and 3 weeks later, David had gone back to his life in Seattle, and I'd discovered I was pregnant. I'd never told Richard. I'd never told anyone. The timing had been close enough that it could have been Richard's baby, and I'd convinced myself that it was, that the night with David had been an aberration born of grief and loneliness.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
That it didn't matter who the biological father was because Richard would be the real father in every way that counted. When Jacob was born with blonde hair and green eyes, so different from Claire's dark features, I told myself it was my Norwegian heritage showing through. When Jacob's personality emerged as more artistic and introspective than Richard's practical engineering mindset, I told myself that children don't always take after their parents. When Jacob reached his teenage years and Richard would comment with mild frustration that he didn't understand his son's interests or way of thinking, I told myself that fathers and sons often struggled to connect. But Claire had heard something that March afternoon. She'd heard me on the phone with someone, though I couldn't remember who or what the conversation had been about. Or maybe she'd heard me talking to myself, working through my guilt and fear in the privacy of my bedroom like I sometimes did when the weight of the secret became too heavy. However it had happened, my daughter had discovered the truth, and she'd carried that burden alone for the last 2 weeks of her life. I turned to the entry from March 15, 2004, dated just 2 days before Claire died. This was the entry I'd read first, the one that had started this nightmare. But now I read it in full and each word felt like a knife. Mom doesn't know that Dad isn't really Jacob's father. I've known for 3 years and it's killing me to keep this secret. But if I tell her, it will destroy our family. I've thought about confronting her, asking her directly, but what would that accomplish? She's already carrying this guilt and this lie. If she knew that I knew, it would just hurt her more. And what about Jacob? He's 12 years old. He worships Dad. He thinks we're this normal, happy family. If he found out that Dad isn't his biological father, it would shatter his whole world. And what about Dad? Does he know? Has Mom told him, or is he living in ignorance like Jacob is? I can't tell if that would be better or worse. Sometimes I look at our family and I see this web of lies and secrets, and I don't know how to untangle it without destroying everything. So I'm going to do what Mom is doing. I'm going to keep the secret. I'm going to protect Jacob's innocence and Dad's heart and Mom's dignity. I'm going to carry this alone because that's what you do when you love people. You protect them even when it costs you something. Even when it costs you everything. 2 days later, Claire had been driving home from play rehearsal when a drunk driver ran a red light and hit her car. She died instantly according to the doctors, though that information had done nothing to ease the agony of losing her. For 20 years I'd believed my daughter's last days had been normal, filled with the usual concerns of a teenager preparing for college and navigating the social dynamics of high school. Now I understood that she'd been carrying a devastating secret, trying to protect all of us from a truth that she thought would tear our family apart. I sat in that dusty attic for hours, reading and rereading Claire's diary entries, trying to understand the full scope of what she'd discovered and what she'd thought she needed to hide. There were other entries too, observations about how I seemed sad sometimes when I looked at Jacob, how Richard would occasionally make comments about Jacob being different from what he'd expected, how Aunt Linda would give me strange looks during family gatherings as if she was worried about something. Claire had been piecing together a puzzle, trying to make sense of the tension she'd sensed in our household, and she'd come to conclusions that were partially true but also partially wrong. Yes, Jacob was not Richard's biological son. That part Claire had understood correctly. But the rest of it, the idea that Richard didn't know, the belief that I was carrying this secret alone, that was where Claire had been mistaken. Because the truth was even more complicated than what my daughter had been able to uncover. Richard knew. He'd known from the beginning. And the real secret, the one that neither Claire nor Jacob nor anyone else in our family understood, was that Richard had made a choice 20 years ago that had bound us all together in a conspiracy of silence that was now unraveling in my hands. I pulled out my phone and stared at Richard's number. He was at the hardware store picking up supplies for a project in the garage. He'd be home in an hour, cheerful and unsuspecting, ready to help me sort through more boxes and make decisions about what to keep and what to finally let go. But everything had changed. The foundation of our life together had been built on a decision we'd made in grief and desperation, and now our dead daughter's words were forcing me to confront what that decision had cost us. I needed to talk to Richard, but I needed to understand the full picture first. I needed to know what else Claire had discovered, what other secrets she'd uncovered in those final days of her life. I turned to the last entry in the diary, dated March 17, 2004. This was written the day she died. Today I decided that some secrets are meant to stay buried. I've been agonizing over what to do with what I know, but I finally understand that the truth doesn't always set you free. Sometimes the truth just destroys everything good that people have built. Mom made a mistake 20 years ago, but she's been a good mother to Jacob. Dad may not be his biological father, but he's been a real father in every way that matters. Jacob is loved and safe and happy. Our family works even if it's built on a foundation that isn't completely honest. Who am I to blow that up? Who am I to decide that my need for truth is more important than everyone else's need for peace? So I'm making a choice. I'm choosing to let this go, to take it to my grave, to let Jacob grow up believing what he's always believed. Maybe that makes me a liar too, but maybe that's what love requires sometimes. Maybe protecting people you care about means carrying burdens they don't need to know exist. I can live with that. I can be strong enough to hold this secret. For Mom. For Dad. For Jacob. For all of us. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. Claire had made that choice, had decided to protect us all, and then she died before she could see whether that choice was the right one. She'd never known that her silence hadn't been necessary because Richard already knew the truth. She'd never known that the secret she was protecting had already been shared, that the decision about what to tell Jacob had already been made years before she discovered anything. She died thinking she was the only one carrying this burden, when in reality she'd been surrounded by people carrying similar burdens, all of us trying to protect each other, all of us trapped in a web of good intentions and terrible choices. I heard the garage door open. Richard was home. I could hear him calling my name, asking if I wanted help bringing down more boxes. In a moment he would climb the attic stairs and find me sitting here with our dead daughter's diary in my hands, and I would have to decide what to tell him. I would have to decide whether to reveal that Claire had known, whether to finally have the conversation we should have had 20 years ago, whether to shatter the careful peace we'd maintained for 2 decades. Because the truth was that everything was about to change. Jacob didn't know he was adopted. He didn't know that Richard wasn't his biological father. He didn't know that his entire life was built on a decision made in the aftermath of grief and guilt. And now I held in my hands evidence that Claire had known, that she'd died carrying our secrets, that she'd sacrificed her own peace of mind to protect a truth that was never going to stay hidden forever. Richard's footsteps were on the attic stairs now. He was calling my name again, his voice concerned because I wasn't answering. In another moment he would see my face and know that something was wrong. He would see the diary in my hands and understand what I'd discovered. And then we would have to face what we'd been avoiding for Jacob's entire life, the conversation we'd promised ourselves we'd have when he was older, when he was ready, when the time was right. Except the time was never going to be right. There was never going to be a perfect moment to tell your 32-year-old son that his entire understanding of his identity was based on a lie. There was never going to be an easy way to explain that his sister had died knowing a secret that he still didn't know. There was never going to be a gentle way to reveal that the family he thought he belonged to was more complicated and fractured than he'd ever imagined. Richard appeared at the top of the attic stairs, and the moment our eyes met, I saw recognition flash across his face. He knew that I'd found something. He knew that our carefully maintained silence was over. He crossed the attic in 3 long strides and sat down beside me on the trunk, not saying anything, just waiting for me to speak. I handed him the diary without a word. He opened it to the page I'd marked and began to read. I watched his face as he processed Claire's words, saw the color drain from his cheeks, saw his jaw clench with emotion. When he finished reading, he closed the diary gently and set it on his lap, staring at it as if it might hold answers to questions we'd been avoiding for 20 years. "We have to tell him," Richard said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "We should have told him years ago." I nodded because there was nothing else to say. He was right. We'd known it for years, but we'd kept finding excuses to wait, reasons to delay, justifications for maintaining the lie just a little longer. But now Claire's words had made it impossible to keep hiding. Our daughter had died protecting a secret that should never have been a secret in the first place. We owed it to her memory to finally tell the truth. How do we even start that conversation? I asked. How do we tell Jacob that everything he thinks he knows about himself is wrong? Richard reached over and took my hand, his grip firm and steady despite the trembling I could see in his shoulders. We tell him the truth. All of it. We tell him about losing his older brother, about how broken we were, about the choices we made. We tell him that he was wanted and loved from the moment he came into our lives. We tell him that biology doesn't determine family, that he's our son in every way that matters. And we tell him about Claire, about what she knew and what she chose to carry for us. Tears were streaming down my face now, years of guilt and fear finally breaking through the careful control I'd maintained for so long. What if he hates us? What if this destroys our relationship with him? What if Sophia decides we're terrible people and keeps the girls away from us? Richard pulled me close and I could feel that he was crying too. Then we accept those consequences. We should have told him when he turned 18. We definitely should have told him before he got married and had children of his own. We've been selfish and cowardly, and now we have to face what that's cost us. But Margaret, we can't keep lying. Not anymore. Not when Claire died trying to protect a lie that was never hers to carry. He was right. I knew he was right. But knowing something intellectually and having the courage to act on it are two very different things. We sat together in that dusty attic, surrounded by boxes of memories and remnants of lives we'd lived, holding our daughter's diary and facing the reality that everything was about to change. Below us, the house felt suddenly foreign, as if seeing it clearly for the first time in 20 years. This was the house where we'd raised our children, where Claire had learned to walk and Jacob had taken his first steps, where we'd celebrated Christmases and birthdays and graduations, where we'd cried together the night we lost Claire and somehow found the strength to keep living. But it was also the house where we'd kept secrets, where we'd built a life on half-truths and necessary lies, where we'd convinced ourselves that protection and deception were the same thing, that love meant hiding painful realities rather than facing them together. When do we tell him? I asked. Richard was quiet for a long moment, and I knew he was weighing the same concerns I was. Jacob and Sophia were planning to come over for dinner on Sunday. The girls had a dance recital on Saturday that we were all attending. Normal family life continuing as it always had, routines and rituals that felt safe and predictable. We call him tonight, Richard said. We ask him to come over tomorrow. Just him without Sophia and the girls. We sit down with him and we tell him everything. We don't give ourselves time to talk ourselves out of it again. We don't wait for the perfect moment because there isn't one. We just do what we should have done 20 years ago. I nodded, feeling something shift inside me. Fear was still there, terror about what this revelation might cost us. But underneath the fear was something else, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. The weight of the secret had been crushing me for decades, affecting every interaction with Jacob, every family gathering, every moment when I looked at my son and saw David's eyes staring back at me and wondered if Richard noticed, if Jacob would ever figure it out on his own, if Claire's death had been some kind of cosmic punishment for my lies. Now that weight was finally going to be lifted. Not easily, not painlessly, but necessarily. Richard stood up and extended his hand to help me to my feet. We left Claire's diary sitting on the trunk and walked downstairs together. The house felt different now, charged with the anticipation of what was coming. We'd spent 20 years pretending that our family was built on a solid foundation. Tomorrow we were going to reveal all the cracks in that foundation and hope that what we'd built was strong enough to survive the truth. That evening, Richard and I sat at our kitchen table with cups of coffee neither of us could drink, rehearsing what we would say to Jacob. Every version sounded worse than the last. There was no gentle way to dismantle someone's entire understanding of their identity. No kind phrasing that could soften the blow of learning that your parents had lied to you for 32 years. Richard kept running his hand through his thinning gray hair, a nervous habit he'd had since I'd known him. His face looked older than it had that morning, as if the decision to finally tell the truth had aged him several years in a matter of hours. "We need to start with the truth about his brother," Richard said, his voice hoarse from the conversation we'd been having in circles for the past 2 hours. "We need to explain why we were in the state we were in when he came into our lives. If we just blurt out that he's adopted, it won't make any sense. Context matters." I nodded, though the thought of talking about our first son still brought a wave of pain even after all these years. We'd named him Thomas after Richard's father. He'd been perfect when he was born, 8 pounds and 2 ounces, with a full head of dark hair and lungs that announced his arrival to the entire maternity ward. For 2 days he'd seemed healthy and normal. We'd brought Claire to the hospital to meet her baby brother, and she'd been enchanted, insisting on holding him while Richard took photos. Then on the 3rd day, Thomas had turned blue in his bassinet. The nurses had rushed him away while I screamed, and Richard had held me back from following them into the emergency room. Hypoplastic left heart syndrome, the doctors had explained later, using technical terms that meant nothing to us, except that our son's heart couldn't sustain his life. He'd needed immediate surgery, complex procedures that might give him a chance but came with terrible risks. We'd authorized everything, signed every form, prayed to a God I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. Thomas had died on the operating table. He was 3 days old. The doctors had tried to comfort us by saying he hadn't suffered, that he'd been under anesthesia, that we'd done everything we could. But none of that had mattered when they'd handed me his tiny body wrapped in a hospital blanket and told me I could hold him one last time. I'd sat in that hospital room for 6 hours, holding my dead son, refusing to let the nurses take him away. Richard had eventually convinced me to let go, but a part of me had never really released that moment, never really accepted that our perfect baby boy was gone. The months that followed had been a blur of grief and dysfunction. I'd stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped caring about anything including Claire, who needed her mother and couldn't understand why I'd disappeared into a fog of depression. Richard had tried to hold everything together, working long hours to pay the medical bills while also trying to care for a confused 5-year-old and a wife who could barely get out of bed. Our marriage had been fracturing under the weight of loss and exhaustion. We'd been drowning, and neither of us had known how to save the other. That's when David had arrived. Richard's college roommate, his best friend since their freshman year at Oregon State, the man who'd been best man at our wedding and godfather to Claire. David's wife Catherine had died of ovarian cancer 2 years earlier, and he understood grief in a way that most people couldn't. He'd taken a leave of absence from his architecture firm in Seattle, and had driven down to Portland to help us survive. For 6 weeks, David had lived in our guest room, cooking meals we barely touched, entertaining Claire when we couldn't, sitting with me in the dark hours when the weight of loss felt too heavy to bear. Richard had been grateful for the help. He'd been so focused on keeping us financially afloat and making sure Claire was okay that he hadn't noticed the way David and I had begun seeking comfort in each other. The long conversations late at night. The way David would hold my hand when I cried. The increasingly intimate nature of our discussions about grief and loss and the cruelty of a universe that took innocent children. I'd known it was wrong. Even in my depressed state, I'd understood that I was crossing boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. But I'd felt so empty, so completely hollowed out by grief, that David's kindness and understanding had felt like the only thing keeping me tethered to life. The night it happened, Richard had been working late again, trying to finish a project that had a deadline he couldn't miss. Claire had been asleep in her room, exhausted from a day at school where her teacher had called Richard to express concern about her behavior. David and I had been sitting in the living room, and I'd been crying again the way I cried every night, mourning not just Thomas but the person I'd been before loss had broken me into pieces. David had put his arm around me. I'd leaned into him, and then somehow his lips had been on mine, and I'd been kissing him back with a desperation that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with needing to feel something other than pain. We'd gone to my bedroom. I'd known it was Richard's and my space, our marital bed, but in that moment, I hadn't cared about anything except making the emptiness inside me feel less. Fast. Afterward, lying next to David in the dark, I'd felt nothing except a deeper wave of self-loathing. I'd betrayed my husband, my marriage, everything I'd believed about myself. David had tried to comfort me, had told me it was okay, that we were both hurting and seeking solace, that these things happen when people were broken. But I'd known it wasn't okay. I'd known I'd crossed a line I could never uncross. David had left 3 days later, returning to Seattle and his own life. We'd promised never to speak of what had happened. He'd sent cards at Christmas for a few years. Then gradually we'd lost touch as friendships do when they're weighted down by guilt and shame. I tried to pretend it had never happened, had worked on rebuilding my marriage and being present for Claire and slowly climbing out of the depression that had swallowed me whole. Then I discovered I was pregnant. The timing had been impossible to determine with certainty. Richard and I had been intimate occasionally during those months, mechanical attempts at connection that neither of us had really wanted but had engaged in anyway because that's what married couples did. The pregnancy could have been Richard's. I told myself it was Richard's, had convinced myself that one night of weakness couldn't result in such permanent consequences. When Jacob was born with features that didn't match either Richard or myself, I'd attributed it to recessive genes and family traits that skipped generations. But Richard had known. Years later, when Jacob was 5 and starting kindergarten, Richard had sat me down and told me he needed to say something he'd been holding back for too long. He'd known about David and me. He'd come home early that night and had seen David's car still in the driveway at midnight, had let himself in quietly and had heard sounds coming from our bedroom that made it clear what was happening. He'd stood in the hallway, he told me, debating whether to burst in and confront us or to simply leave. In the end, he'd chosen to leave, had driven around for hours, had eventually parked at a playground and cried until dawn. When he'd come home the next morning, we'd both pretended nothing had happened. David had left soon after, and Richard had made a decision that would shape the rest of our lives. He'd chosen to forgive me. Not because he'd stopped hurting, he'd explained, but because he'd understood that I'd been destroyed by grief and that my betrayal had come from brokenness rather than malice. He'd chosen to try to save our marriage rather than destroy it. And when I'd announced I was pregnant, Richard had chosen to claim the baby as his own, to raise this child as his son, regardless of biology. I'd broken down when he'd told me. The weight of knowing that Richard had carried this knowledge for 5 years, had looked at Jacob and loved him anyway, had pretended not to notice when people commented on how different Jacob looked from the rest of the family, had been almost more than I could bear. We'd cried together that day, finally grieving not just for Thomas but for the trust we'd broken and the innocence we'd lost. Richard had made me promise that we would tell Jacob the truth eventually, when he was old enough to understand, when the knowledge wouldn't destroy him. But then years had passed. Jacob had grown from a sweet child into a sensitive teenager who struggled with fitting in and finding his place in the world. Telling him he was adopted and that his biological father wasn't Richard had seemed like it would only add to his struggles. We'd kept postponing the conversation, finding reasons to wait. When Jacob graduated high school, when he finished college, when he was established in his career, when he met Sophia and fell in love, when they got married, when the twins were born, there was always another milestone, another reason to delay, another justification for maintaining the lie just a little longer. Now, sitting in our kitchen 27 years after Richard had first confronted me with the truth he'd known all along, we were finally out of excuses. Claire's diary had made it impossible to keep hiding. Our daughter had died trying to protect a secret that should never have been hers to carry, and we couldn't let that sacrifice be meaningless by continuing to lie. Richard's phone was on the table between us. All we had to do was call Jacob and ask him to come over tomorrow. Just a simple phone call, an invitation for a conversation. But Richard's hand hovered over the phone without picking it up, and I understood his hesitation. Once we made this call, once we set this in motion, there would be no taking it back. We would be irrevocably changing our relationship with our son, and we had no way of knowing whether that relationship would survive the truth. What if he never forgives us? I asked, voicing the fear that had been sitting in my chest like a stone since I'd found the diary. What if this destroys everything we've built with him? Richard finally picked up his phone, but his hand was shaking. Then at least we'll have finally been honest with him. At least we'll have given him the truth he deserves. Margaret, we've been protecting ourselves, not him. We've been avoiding this conversation because we're afraid of losing him, not because telling him would actually hurt him. The hurt is in the lying, in the decades of deception. The truth might be painful, but it's also liberation. He dialed Jacob's number before either of us could talk ourselves out of it. The phone rang twice before Jacob answered, his voice cheerful and relaxed. "Hey Dad, what's up? Is everything okay?" Richard's voice was steady as he spoke, years of engineering training allowing him to control his emotions even in crisis. "Jacob, your mom and I need to talk to you about something important. Can you come over tomorrow? Maybe around 10 in the morning? Just you, not Sophia and the girls." There was a pause on the other end of the line. I could imagine Jacob's expression changing from casual to concerned, wondering what could be so serious that we needed to see him alone. "Is someone sick? Are you and Mom okay?" "We're fine physically," Richard assured him. "But there's something we need to discuss with you. Something we should have talked about a long time ago. It's important, son." Another pause, longer this time. "Okay," Jacob said slowly. "I can be there at 10. Are you sure everything's okay? You're kind of freaking me out here." "We'll explain everything tomorrow," Richard said. "Just know that we love you, and nothing about that is going to change." After Richard hung up, we sat in silence, the weight of what we'd just set in motion settling over us like a heavy blanket. Jacob would spend the night wondering what could be so serious, probably imagining worst-case scenarios that likely didn't include the actual truth. Sophia would ask him what the call was about, and he'd have no good answer to give her. Our granddaughters would sense the tension and worry in ways that children always seem to pick up on adult stress. I thought about Claire again, about how she'd made the decision to carry our secret alone. She'd been 17, still a child herself in many ways, and she'd taken on a burden that had ultimately died with her. What would she think about what we were doing now? Would she be relieved that we were finally telling the truth, or would she feel like her sacrifice had been wasted? I wanted to believe she'd understand that wherever she was, she'd know we were trying to do the right thing even if it was 20 years too late. Richard and I didn't sleep that night. We lay in bed staring at the ceiling, holding hands in the dark, preparing ourselves for a conversation that would reshape our family. Around 3 in the morning, Richard turned to me and said, "I need you to know something. I've never regretted claiming Jacob as my son. Not once, not even on the hardest days. He's my boy in every way that matters. Biology is just genetics. Love is what makes a family." His words made me cry again, but they were different tears this time. Not tears of fear or guilt, but tears of gratitude for a man who had chosen forgiveness and love over anger and resentment. Richard had every right to hate me for what I'd done, to reject Jacob as a living reminder of my betrayal. Instead, he'd chosen to be a father, to build a relationship with a child who shared none of his DNA but all of his values and heart. Morning came too quickly. I made coffee and tried to eat toast that tasted like cardboard in my mouth. Richard showered and dressed carefully, as if preparing for a business meeting rather than the dismantling of our family's foundation. We moved around each other in the practice dance of a long marriage, both of us lost in our own thoughts but connected by our shared purpose. At 9:30, we sat down in the living room and waited. I'd put Claire's diary on the coffee table, knowing we'd need to show it to Jacob, needing him to understand that his sister had known and had loved him enough to keep the secret. The diary sat there like an unexploded bomb, innocent-looking but containing the power to destroy everything we'd built. At exactly 10 o'clock, we heard Jacob's car pull into the driveway. Richard squeezed my hand one more time, and then we both stood up to face what we'd been avoiding for 3 decades. Jacob let himself in with his key, calling out a greeting as he always did. When he walked into the living room and saw our faces, his smile faded immediately. He was 32 years old, a successful graphic designer with his own small firm, a devoted husband and father, and in that moment he looked exactly like the worried little boy who used to come to me with scraped knees and hurt feelings. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. "You both look like someone died." "Sit down, sweetheart," I said, gesturing to the armchair across from where Richard and I sat on the couch. "We need to tell you something, and it's going to be difficult to hear." Jacob sat slowly, his eyes moving between Richard and me, trying to read what was coming. "I've been going through the attic," I began, my voice shaking despite my efforts to stay calm. "The roof needs repairs, and I had to clear everything out. I found something that belonged to Claire." At the mention of his sister's name, Jacob's expression softened. He'd been 12 when Claire died, and her loss had shaped his adolescence in profound ways. He rarely talked about her, but I knew he thought about her often, wondered what she'd be like now, imagined the relationship they might have had if she'd lived. "What did you find?" he asked. I picked up the diary and held it in my hands, not ready to give it to him yet. Claire kept a journal during her senior year. I never knew it existed. It was hidden in a box in the attic with some of her other belongings. And in this journal, she wrote about something she discovered. Something about our family that she thought she needed to keep secret. Jacob leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. I could see confusion and growing concern in his face. "What kind of secret?" Richard cleared his throat, taking over when my voice failed me. "Jacob, before we tell you what Claire discovered, we need to give you some context. We need to tell you about something that happened before you were born, something we've never talked about with you. You had an older brother," I said, the words coming out in a rush. "His name was Thomas. He was born when Claire was 5 years old. He died 3 days later from a heart defect we didn't know he had." Jacob sat back in his chair, his face going pale. "I had a brother? You had another child who died? Why didn't you ever tell me this?" "Because it was too painful," Richard said quietly. "We lost him and then we lost ourselves for a while. Your mother went into a severe depression. I was working constantly trying to pay the medical bills and take care of Claire. We were barely functioning as a family. We were falling apart. David came to help us," I continued each word, feeling like I was pulling it out of my chest. "Richard's friend from college. He stayed with us for several weeks, helping to take care of Claire and the house while we tried to survive. And during that time, during those terrible months when I was completely broken, I made a terrible mistake." Jacob's eyes were locked on my face, and I could see him starting to understand where this was going. "What kind of mistake?" "I had an affair," I said, forcing myself to meet his eyes even though shame was burning through me. "One night, when Richard was working late and I was drowning in grief, I slept with David. It was one terrible decision born out of pain and brokenness. And 3 weeks later I discovered I was pregnant with you." The silence that followed was deafening. Jacob stared at me, then at Richard, then back at me, his mind clearly trying to process what I just told him. "Wait," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you telling me that Richard's not my biological father? That this David person is my real dad?" Richard spoke up then, his voice firm and clear. "I am your real father, Jacob. I've been your father since the day you were born. I held you in the hospital. I walked the floors with you when you had colic. I taught you to ride a bike and helped you with your homework and sat in the front row at every one of your school plays. Biology doesn't make someone a father. Love and commitment and showing up every single day, that's what makes a father." "But you're not actually my father," Jacob said, his voice rising. "You've been lying to me my entire life. Both of you have been lying to me. Do you even know for sure? Did you do a paternity test?" I shook my head. "No, we never did a test. But Jacob, the timing, your features, everything suggested that David was probably your biological father. Though Richard and I were also intimate during that period, so there was always a chance." Jacob stood up abruptly, his hands shaking. "So you don't even know for certain, but you just assumed and you never told me. You let me grow up thinking I was one person when I might be someone completely different. Do you have any idea how messed up that is?" "You're right," Richard said, standing up as well. "It is messed up. We made terrible decisions, and we've been making terrible decisions ever since by not telling you the truth. We were wrong and we're sorry." "Sorry?" Jacob's laugh was bitter and sharp. "You're sorry? That's supposed to make up for 32 years of lies? I asked you yesterday if something was wrong, and you said everything was fine. You've had 3 decades to tell me this, and you chose to keep lying right up until whatever forced your hand." "Claire knew," I said quietly, and Jacob froze. "That's what she wrote about in her diary. She discovered the truth about 3 weeks before she died. She overheard a conversation, found hospital records, pieced together what had happened, and she made a decision to keep it secret to protect all of us." Jacob's face crumpled, and suddenly he wasn't a 32-year-old man anymore. He was the heartbroken 12-year-old boy who'd lost his sister, standing at her grave and wondering why the world was so unfair. "Claire knew. She knew and she never told me? She died keeping your secret?" Richard moved toward Jacob, reaching out to comfort him, but Jacob stepped back. Don't, he said, his voice breaking. Don't touch me right now. I can't, I need a minute here. He sank back into the chair, his head in his hands. The diary lay on the coffee table between us, Claire's words waiting to be read. After several long minutes, Jacob looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. I want to read it. I want to see what Claire wrote. I handed him the diary, already open to the relevant pages. Jacob read slowly, his finger tracing his sister's handwriting, as if he could somehow connect with her through the words she'd written 2 decades ago. I watched emotions play across his face as he processed what Claire had discovered and how she'd chosen to handle it. When he finished reading, he closed the diary carefully and set it back on the table. She thought she was protecting me, he said softly. She thought telling me would shatter my world. And she was right. My world is pretty much shattered right now. Jacob, Richard said, sitting back down on the couch. I need you to understand something. The day you were born, I made a choice. I chose to be your father regardless of biology. I chose to love you and raise you as my son. That wasn't a sacrifice or an obligation. It was a privilege. You've been one of the greatest joys of my life. I would make the same choice again in a heartbeat. But you should have told me, Jacob said, anger creeping back into his voice. You should have told me when I was old enough to understand. You should have given me the choice about whether I wanted to know my biological father. You took that choice away from me. He was right and we both knew it. There was no defense for what we'd done, no justification that would make the deception acceptable. We'd robbed Jacob of knowledge about his own identity, and no amount of love or good intentions could undo that theft. Do you know where David is now? Jacob asked. Is he still alive? Do you still talk to him? I shook my head. We lost touch years ago. The last I heard, he'd remarried and moved to California, but that was more than 20 years ago. I don't know if he's still alive or where he might be living now. Does he know about me? Does he know he might have a son? No, Richard said. We never told him. After he left, we cut contact. It seemed like the kindest thing for everyone involved. Now I'm not sure it was the right decision, but at the time it felt like the only way to move forward. So not only did you lie to me, but you potentially kept a man from knowing he had a child. Jacob stood up again, pacing now, his agitation growing. Did you ever think about him? Did you ever wonder if he had a right to know? What if he wanted children and never had any? What if I have half-siblings out there somewhere that I don't know about? What if there's a whole other family that I'm connected to? These were all questions we'd asked ourselves over the years, questions we'd suppressed because they were too complicated and painful to fully explore. Yes, I said honestly. I've thought about all of those things, and I don't have good answers. We made choices that seemed right at the time, or at least seemed like the least wrong option available to us. But those choices had consequences we didn't fully consider, consequences that affected not just us but you and potentially David as well. Jacob stopped pacing and looked at us both with an expression that combined hurt and anger and confusion. I need time, he said. I need to process this. I can't just sit here and have a rational conversation about how my entire life has been a lie. Of course, Richard said. Take all the time you need. We're here whenever you're ready to talk more. But Jacob, please know that we love you. That's never been a lie. Jacob's laugh was hollow. How am I supposed to know what's true and what's a lie anymore? You've been lying to me about something fundamental for my entire life. What else haven't you told me? Is there anything else I should know? Richard and I looked at each other. There was nothing else, no other secrets of this magnitude hiding in our past. This was it, the one terrible truth we'd been concealing. That's everything, I said. I swear to you, Jacob, there are no other secrets. This is the only thing we've kept from you. Jacob picked up Claire's diary again, holding it against his chest as if it was the only real thing in a world that had suddenly become unstable. Can I keep this? I want to read all of it, not just the parts about me. I want to know what else she was thinking about in those final weeks. Of course, I said. It's as much yours as it is mine. She was your sister. You have every right to her words. Jacob walked toward the door, then paused with his hand on the doorknob. I'm going to need to tell Sophia about this. She's going to have questions too. She's going to want to know why you waited so long, why you're telling me now. What should I tell her? Tell her the truth, Richard said. Tell her we were cowards who kept putting off a difficult conversation until we ran out of excuses. Tell her we're sorry and we're trying to do better, even if it's too late. Jacob nodded slowly, then opened the door and walked out without another word. We heard his car start and pull out of the driveway, and then the house was silent except for the ticking of the clock in the hallway and the sound of my own ragged breathing. Richard pulled me close, and we stood there in our living room holding each other while our world crumbled around us. We'd done what we'd set out to do. We told Jacob the truth, but the relief I'd anticipated didn't come. Instead, I felt hollowed out, as if the act of finally being honest had carved away something essential from inside me. What have we done? I whispered against Richard's shoulder. We've hurt him so badly. We did what we should have done years ago, Richard said, but his voice was heavy with grief. Now we have to live with the consequences and hope that eventually he'll be able to forgive us. I thought about Jacob driving home to Sophia, having to explain to his wife that his parents had lied to him for his entire life. I thought about him looking at his daughters and wondering if they'd grow up to lie to him too, if deception was some kind of inherited trait passed down through families built on secrets. I thought about Claire and the burden she'd carried in her final days, trying to protect us all from a truth that had eventually found its way into the light anyway. The rest of that day passed in a blur. Richard and I moved through the house like ghosts, unable to focus on anything except what had happened that morning. The phone rang several times, but neither of us had the energy to answer it. We made sandwiches we didn't eat and sat in front of the television watching programs we couldn't follow. We were waiting, though we didn't know exactly what we were waiting for. Some sign that Jacob would be okay, that our relationship with him could survive this revelation, that we hadn't destroyed our family by finally telling the truth. At 7 o'clock that evening, my phone buzzed with a text message from Sophia. Jacob told me everything. I'm angry at you both for lying to him, but I understand why you're telling him now. He needs space tonight, but I think he'll want to talk more tomorrow or the next day. Please don't try to contact him. Let him come to you when he's ready. I'm taking care of him. The message was both a relief and a fresh source of pain. Relief that Sophia was supporting Jacob, that he had someone to help him process what he'd learned. Pain because my son needed to be protected from me, because I'd become someone he needed space from rather than someone he turned to for comfort. Richard read the message over my shoulder and nodded. That's fair, he said. He needs time and we need to respect that. But what if he decides he can't forgive us? I asked, voicing the fear that had been growing all day. What if this is it? What if we've lost him? Then we accept that consequence, Richard said, though I could hear the pain in his voice. We made choices that led to this moment. We don't get to control how Jacob responds to learning the truth. All we can do is give him space and hope that eventually he'll be willing to talk to us again. That night I dreamed about Claire. She was 17 again, sitting in her room writing in the purple diary, and when she looked up and saw me, she smiled. It's okay, Mom, she said in the dream. You did the right thing. Jacob needed to know. I'm sorry I died before I could help you tell him. I woke up crying, Richard's arms around me in the dark, whispering that it would be okay even though neither of us knew if that was true. The next 3 days were torture. We heard nothing from Jacob. Sophia sent one more text saying he was okay but still processing, that he'd been doing a lot of research about late discovery adoptees and identity issues, that he was talking to a therapist about how to handle what he'd learned. The fact that Jacob needed professional help to deal with what we told him felt like confirmation that we damaged him in ways that might never fully heal. Richard threw himself into the roof repairs, working with the contractor to assess the damage and plan the fixes. I tried to continue sorting through the attic, but everything I touched reminded me of Claire or Jacob or the family we'd been before the truth had torn us apart. I found myself sitting in the attic for hours surrounded by boxes, unable to make any decisions about what to keep and what to let go. On the 4th day, Jacob called. His voice on the phone was careful, controlled, like he was speaking to a colleague rather than his mother. I want to talk again, he said. But this time I want Sophia there with me. I think I need someone on my side. Someone to help me ask the questions I need to ask. Of course, I said immediately. Whatever you need. We can meet whenever you're ready. Tomorrow afternoon? Jacob suggested. 2 o'clock? We'll come to your house. Sophia's parents are watching the girls so we can talk without interruption. That's perfect, I said, though my heart was racing. We'll be here. Jacob, I just want you to know that I love you. I know I've said that before, but I need you to hear it again. There was a long pause. I know you love me, Mom, he said finally. That's what makes this so hard. If you didn't love me, the lying would make sense. But you do love me, and you lied anyway, and I don't know how to reconcile those two things. Then he hung up, and I was left holding the phone, his words echoing in my mind. How did you reconcile love and lies? How did you explain that you could care deeply for someone and still make choices that hurt them? These were questions I didn't have answers to, questions that cut to the core of who I was as a person and as a mother. Richard and I spent the next day preparing for Jacob and Sophia's visit the way we might prepare for a trial. We made lists of things we needed to explain, questions we anticipated they might ask, information we should have ready. We decided to tell Jacob everything we knew about David, to give him the option of searching for his biological father if that was what he wanted. We gathered what few photographs we had from that period, trying to find pictures that showed David so Jacob could see what he looked like, could begin to understand the physical connection he might have to a man he'd never known. At 2 o'clock exactly, Jacob and Sophia arrived. Jacob looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. Sophia held his hand as they walked into our living room, a united front that made it clear where her loyalties lay. We all sat down in the same positions we'd been in 4 days earlier, but everything felt different now. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a deeper, more complex grief. Jacob spoke first, his voice steady but cold. I've been doing a lot of reading about situations like mine. People who find out late in life that they're adopted, or that their parentage isn't what they thought it was. Do you know what the consistent theme is in all those stories? Richard and I shook our heads, waiting for him to continue. The consistent theme is that the people who kept the secret always thought they were protecting the adoptee. They always thought they were doing the right thing. And the adoptees, the people whose identities were lied about, they consistently say they would have rather known the truth from the beginning. That the lying did more damage than the truth ever could have. He was right, and there was nothing we could say to argue with him. The research was clear. The experiences of other families in similar situations confirmed what Jacob was saying. We'd convinced ourselves we were protecting him, but really we'd been protecting ourselves from a difficult conversation. I know I said quietly, "You're absolutely right. We were wrong to wait so long. We were wrong to lie to you at all." "I'm not asking if you know you were wrong," Jacob said, an edge of frustration in his voice. "I'm asking you to understand how profoundly you've affected my sense of self. I'm 32 years old. I have a career, a wife, children. I've built a life based on an understanding of who I am that you've now revealed was false. Do you have any idea how destabilizing that is?" Sophia spoke up then, her voice calm but firm. "What Jacob is trying to say is that this isn't just about biology or genetics. It's about trust and honesty and the foundation of his identity. He's been questioning everything over the past few days. Every memory, every family story, every assumption about where he came from and who he is. That kind of existential crisis is incredibly painful, and it was completely avoidable if you'd just been honest with him from the beginning." Richard admitted we'd failed Jacob profoundly. We offered to help him find David if he wanted, provided old photos and contact information we'd kept. Jacob said he needed time to decide, that rebuilding trust would take years. Sophia suggested family therapy. We agreed immediately. Over the following months, Jacob slowly opened up again. He decided not to search for David yet, saying Richard was his real father regardless of biology. We attended therapy together, working through decades of pain. The twins asked why Grandpa and Uncle Jacob seemed sad, and Jacob told them age-appropriate truths about family complexity. Claire's diary remained on Jacob's shelf, a reminder that secrets hurt everyone. Our family survived, scarred but honest at last. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.